So when people are watching, I'm going to present myself as being creative. But the values and beliefs of the Bank of England are about conservative, non-creative behaviour. So when no one's watching, I'm going to naturally step back to the behaviours which are supported by the beliefs and values. As I said, eventually those beliefs and values will migrate across to the more creative expectation. But when you try to change the culture by rewarding new behaviours, you've got to remember that the beliefs and values that drive behaviours are actually aligned with something different. And that's why we describe culture as what people do when no one is watching, because that's their normal go-to response as a result of this is the values of the organisation, which comprises all of the sources we talked about. So that's what I really believe, and that's the way I should behave, even though I know that my boss wants me to behave differently. Yep.
Let's say there's going to be the launch of a very big organisation, a new one, and all of these things will still be present there, like values, beliefs.
Yes, yes, because they come with the people. Yes.
So, say the egg and hen situation, which would come first? Like, they would define the values theoretically. Okay, this we're going to sort this out.
You can't really define the values or the beliefs. You just build those. I remember many years ago seeing a presentation from the American CEO of Disneyland Hong Kong. And he was very enthusiastic, very in-your-face sort of American manager. And all of his senior staff were all older Chinese, Hong Kongese. And he got up there and he talked about how they were, used a whole range of American language about being successful and forcing themselves down and stomping on the competition, a whole range of things. And you could see the staff cringing because this is not what they personally were comfortable with. But he was in charge, so they had to let him have his say. But their values and beliefs, you don't do this, you don't get up and speak like this, you don't have this attitude. It's more about respect and use of networks and culture, and that was their values and beliefs. So even though this had just been started up, this organisation, the values and beliefs were already there. These are the senior managers. So this is the CEO, and then these are all the senior managers at the next level. Were all Chinese, or Hong Kongese. So even at the senior level, that was the values and beliefs, but the behaviours that the CEO was going to reward were completely out of line. As a result, the Hong Kong Disneyland struggled for very many years because it was sort of torn between this, I'm being seen, so I better behave like this, and then the natural behaviour which was associated with the values and beliefs.
How did it get stable and what state?
It took 20 years. And basically, it ended up being a compromise between the two. And just speaking of Disneyland, you can tell that I used to have young kids because I saw lots of Disneylands. Disneyland in France was a very amusing one as well because normally you go to Disneyland, the food is terrible. It's all cafeteria food, soggy chips and things that you shouldn't be eating and are at outrageous prices. But if you go to Euro Disney, which is located about an hour out of Paris, two things you see. One thing is you go into these cafeterias, they're exactly the same, but the food is actually edible because there's absolutely no point in serving soggy chips in France because literally no one will buy them. So one thing was that even though they tried, this is the burger stand and there's this and that, there's no way the chef was actually producing food or the cooks were actually producing food like the American food to come out there. So somehow, even though it was incredibly regulated, it's like going to McDonald's in a particular country and the food is just fundamentally different. How did that happen? So that, and the other amusing thing that I always remember seeing was the French are probably more interested in style than high levels of cleanliness and keeping everything very orderly. But one of the features of Disneyland is the organisational cultural expectation is that the place is spotless. Like everything is swept 5 or 6 times a day. And so you would see these French cleaning staff with brooms and shovels cleaning what they considered to be already clean, but they were being paid to do that. And you could see the bewilderment on their face. Like, why am I doing this? There's no dirt, but I've been told that I have to do it. And so day after day, I have to come out and sweep when I feel that there's absolutely no reason to do. And again, it was this national culture said, that's good enough. Let's get about the more important things in life. And the organisational behavioural expectations, no, everything gets cleaned 5 times a day. If there's a leaf on the ground, it can't stay there for more than 30 minutes. Empty the ashtray 7 times a day, all these sorts of things. So there was this fundamental cultural gap between the behaviours. So yeah, you start something up and automatically, as soon as you bring people in, you're bringing professional, regional and national cultural factors in, which really influence what you can and can't do. Okay, so values, I think we talked about them at some length. So values lead to beliefs. So what you believe is, what you understand is or feel is most important, leads to your beliefs as to what should happen and therefore influences your behaviour. So, for example, if your values are about being part of a community and supporting each other, then your belief is, when there's an opportunity, I should support people. I should be friendly, I should be open, I should be helpful. And when the opportunity physically arises, then your behaviour is, can I help? Because that's driven originally from your values, which determine your beliefs. So that's an example of how those things work. So this results in what we've referred to here as the paradigm, but it's really just what you get. And so it's what you find within the organisation. It's not the way people are before they walk in the gate, it's when they actually arrive in the organisation, and it determines what you actually get from your staff. Predominantly behaviours, but also decision-making processes and many other things as well. So it influences how people understand issues. Oh, that's really important. It's so important that we sweep the ground 7 times a day in Disneyland, because cleanliness is the primary goal. Is the behaviour that you're expecting. You'll get that in some places, but you won't get it in other places. So it includes basic assumptions about what the organisation's about. Euro Disney is all about cleanliness, or Euro Disney is all about fun, or it's all about food. It tells people what to do. When there is no managerial control, where there's no specific rule, then they'll fall back to this paradigm that what is the appropriate behaviour. I've just had a customer come. We don't normally accept returns, but this is clearly our fault. What do we do here? And in one organisation, they'll say, well, we have to accept the return because we're responsible. Another organisation will say, no, the rules say that we don't accept returns, so I'm sorry, but you have to go away. So when there's no particular overriding factor, I guess in that example there was a bit of a rule, but when there was no, it was an exceptional situation where it was really unclear as to what to do, there's no management staff to make decisions, then staff will fall back to this paradigm in order to determine what they do. And of course, at a very low level, this is happening frequently. It happens many times every day for every single staff member. So in reality, it influences the bulk of the decisions that are made by the organisation, but in very small increments. Subcultures. We talked already about maybe an international organisation having different subsidiaries and therefore a different culture in each of those subsidiaries. You can also have subcultures in the same country. If you take the wine industry, for example, if you're a winemaker, then your winery has a particular culture. We've been here for 150 years. We were started by this person whose painting is on the wall by the front door when you come in. We're known for the unusual nature of our white wines. We've always had this massive connection with our local community where we get all our grapes from, etc., etc. And then another winery will be, we're all about being different, being fun, wines for enjoyment. We're new, we like lots of technology, and many organised wineries or wine companies are comprised of many wineries because they're usually not very large. They may have up to 20 employees on the most part. So a large wine producer like Treasury Wines might have 30 or 40 different wineries in their portfolio. And as a result of that, they'll have 30 or 40 different cultures. And one, safety is paramount. Another one, well, you know, just try to be careful. Another one, creativity is the key. And another one, nope, we've made this wine the same way for the last 150 years, and we're going to keep making it that way because we have a grand tradition. So subcultures, of course, enormously affect what you can and can't do in the organisation. So, cultural glue creates a high degree of consistency in behaviours between individuals in the organisation. So when what you're trying to do is in alignment with the culture, that's great because everyone can be relied on to behave the same. And if you want to do something that's at odds with the culture, then you can rely on everyone resisting that in the same way. So it creates consistency, which is a two-edged sword, either helps or hinders the sorts of things that you're trying to do. There's a very strong argument, I was actually going to start with this and I decided to take a different path instead, that culture is much more important than strategy in influencing what the organisation can do. The rather unfortunate saying that's very popular, has been for a long time, is culture eats strategy for breakfast. In other words, you can have this great plan, you can have these senior management emergent responses to environmental factors, you can have all of these characteristics, but the culture is going to be more dominant in influencing what your organisation can and can't do and how it's successful than all of the planning and responding and decision making that you can do at the strategy level. So there is a very strong argument that strategy is captured by culture. There are, of course, ways, as we discussed, of moving around that by simply establishing a new division with new people in a new environment that is more consistent and using that to support the culture. So there are ways around it, but by just taking your Bank of England and all the resources and capability it has and said, okay, our new culture is to be international, it's going to be very difficult. On the other hand, if your strategy was to be very successful in the local market through traditional values and responses and institutional recognition in the industry, then that's going to be very consistent and going to be quite successful. So culture really has a huge influence on the strategy that you can have. And as I said, culture has a long tail to it, and so it's not quickly changed. I used the example before of the cruise liner. When it's going in a particular direction, it takes a long time to turn. As on the news today, there was someone who had unfortunately fallen off a cruise liner, and they said they turned the ship around and they've come back to try and find this person, but they're not having any success, unfortunately. But I thought about it, I thought probably took them an hour to get back there by the time that they'd slowly turned this big ship around and come all the way back around because of how long it takes to make that change. So in the same sense, if you say our culture, we've just noticed our culture is out of line, there's been a big change in the industry, we do things fundamentally differently now, everyone works on a commission basis, we've got to change, it's going to take years before you can get back to that, you can get to that point that you observed. Okay, so how does it influence? Well, we tend to have our culture at the very beginning. If the organisation is strictly greenfield and three people sit down and they say, this is how we're going to do, this is our strategy for the organisation. We're not going to employ anyone yet, get the strategy in place first. The culture that they bring, their professional background, their personal experiences already influence the strategy that they have. So culture is there from day one. In this scenario of a new organisation, carefully starting with a completely developed strategy before they do anything else, then, okay, a strategy is developed. Most cases, of course, the organisation's already in operation or it's already started and they're still trying to develop the strategy. So there's a highly emergent component which just runs across the whole top of this. But either way, there's some development post-cultural influence. Then, of course, okay, well, we've got our culture and this is why we do things, but we want to do this, so we're going to implement some changes. We're going to employ some more staff, we're going to get some more technology, we're going to retrain people, try and shift the culture a bit. We're going to do all of these things. This is part of our implementation. And then, hopefully, we'll perform a bit better, because that's the whole purpose of strategy. At that point, we get some feedback. If it works well, we can say, look, it's working really well, so the whole idea of moving everyone to a performance payment basis is much better than the other approach we had of life employment and the rest of it. So, you know, we really are going to need to move more in that direction. So there will be some change in the culture in response to that, because people will see the inevitability of that. Well, if we keep going with the life employment, the organisation is probably going to close down, in which case everyone loses their job anyway. So I guess it's better to accept the new environment than it is to insist on sticking with the old one, and then everyone loses their job. It's also going to, of course, we're going to have feedback and say, well, we got half of the strategy right and half of it wrong. So it's going to feed back a bit on changing the strategy, and of course also, well, it was a pretty good strategy, but we messed up in the implementation a couple of areas. We really underestimated the time or the difficulty, so we've got to revise how we implement things. Cultural web, we've pretty much already covered this. It's really just a collection. The thing at the centre is what you get, which is essentially the behaviours, but as I said, also the basis of decision making, the rules and everything like that. And we've got stories, we've got symbols, we've got power structures, which we haven't really talked about. That's the relative influence. So in a hierarchical sense, of course, the more senior someone is in the organisation, the more power they have. But there are other sources of power as well, which include holding key information or holding key resources. So not surprisingly, the finance director in an organisation is often very powerful because they hold the key to the money. So if you want to implement a new strategy, you've got to have the finance director on side, or they're going to say, you know what, we can't really afford to do that. Or they might say, it's going to be a stretch, but I think we can support this because I'm really keen on that initiative. So as a result of having control over key resources like money or information, then people can have power. They can also have power because of networking, informal networks through the organisation. Someone has been with the organisation since it started. They're perhaps only in middle management, but they know everybody, and they're able to influence what happens by use of their internal political power. Structure is obvious. Control systems, all the rules and regulations that we use to make the organisation behave in a particular way. We talked about routines and rituals and the annual Christmas party and these sorts of things all determine what are displays of what's expected, and over time influence the culture. For example, if at the annual Christmas party every year the CEO is both generous, perhaps giving everyone a gift, but also very open, then year on year on year, people are going to get the feeling that, you know, at least in this once a year I see CEO behaving very openly, so, you know, I'm feeling like this is a relaxed organisation where you can be genuine and open, and openness must be really important, so I'm going to become open too. It might take 10 years for that really to percolate through, but even a simple little routine or ritual like that can, over the long term, can have a significant effect. And stories. The CEO started this organisation with only $2.50 in his pocket, and he slaved away and he worked hard and he was committed, and it took him years and many failures, but finally he was successful. What does that mean? That's a story about how you should be thrifty, how you should be committed, and that pervades the culture of the organisation. Okay, so the elements, we've got all of those. I think there's not much more to be said about them. There's a few more examples of different sources of each of those. So how do we conduct a cultural analysis? Well, we can use that cultural web framework. It's really just a checklist to say, do we know about each of these dimensions? Have we collected the information that relates to stories? Have we collected information about symbols, about power structures, and so forth? We can look in different sources, we can speak to people, we can observe how managers behave, we can collect information about their regulations and procedures, we can look at the company reports to see what the CEO says and how they report on things, and we can then determine what's going to happen. But of course, some items, such as the public domain stuff, might be a little massaged or adjusted to make the organisation appear the way they wish to. So, as that quotation we had a little bit earlier suggested, the culture is what you get when no one's looking. So, you really need to observe, look at the day-to-day correspondence, the day-to-day behaviours to get a true grasp of what the culture is, as opposed to the public domain, if you like, face of the organisation, which will include some publicity and public profile dimensions, as well as the reality of the culture. So the cultural web will tend to result in a lot of detail. There'll be some conflicting aspects. There'll be some variation because of the effect of different departments with their own subcultures, different divisions, different subsidiaries, which will all create some variation. So you'll tend to have a large volume of information. And so it's really important to look at all of this and try and decide what's common to the organisation and what's unique to maybe a particular segment only of the organisation and doesn't reflect its broader behaviours. As I intimated, if you need to change the strategy because the world's changed or there's just a better way to compete, you've got a big problem. It will require a change to the culture, and that's enormous. So the classic example I like to use is IBM in the 1980s found that even though they were the ones who really introduced the concept of the personal computer or really pushed it into becoming a significant market in the mid-1980s, they themselves were not customer focused. And so as individuals started to have control of their own computers and started to therefore express their demands at a personal level rather than an organisational level, IBM was completely incapable of responding to that. And their response would typically have been, so you're asking for something. We've got a new model of our computer coming out. It's got these features. So you should buy that. And then the customer would say, but I was asking about something else. Yes, but let us tell you about our new model. It's got these features. You'll want that. So, of course, it didn't work well for them. It took 15 years to change the culture to being customer focused, because everyone who worked at IBM was about the IBM way of doing things, and the customer was completely unimportant. They were, at best, over the history, institutional purchases anyway, so there was no individual customer focus required. And so the whole culture was nothing about, it was all about IBM, it was nothing about the customer. And to move to a customer-oriented culture that could respond to and adapt to customer needs was massively painful. And they ended up losing 50% of their staff. 50% of the people said, I'm not going to work in this environment. I'm not interested in the customer. I can't do that. And they ended up losing half their staff over a 15-year period, basically in order to change the culture sufficiently. And not massively, just barely enough to accommodate the new strategy. The very strategy that they basically introduced themselves by pushing personal computing onto the market. So this is the sort of challenge that's faced. It's cultural change should not be viewed lightly. It's a serious issue. Strategic drift. So what happens is that we continue to, we have our idea that our organisation is going to compete on the basis of cost, and we continue to follow that. And we adjust things. We say, okay, you know what, we're going to lift our costs a bit because customer expectations have risen dramatically. We can't meet them at the lower cost, but they're prepared to pay a bit more, so we'll just follow that trend along. What usually happens, however, and we really lack a decent whiteboard here, but you can imagine what happens is your strategy direction goes that way, but the environment goes that way. And these slow and subtle changes are not enough over time to keep up with where the environment is moving to. And so the gap gets bigger and bigger, and this is what's referred to as strategic drift. Why don't we keep pace, mainly because of the speed with which you can change culture. So you can imagine if from my IBM example you said, okay, it takes 15 years to make a major change to culture. And your environment changes in such a way that you need to make that major change in 7.5 years. Well, by 7.5 years, of course, you're only halfway there. So the culture will often reduce the rate of change to below what you need to have. If you've got a very change-oriented culture, yep, we can do something differently tomorrow. What? I don't have my job on next week? That's okay, I'll go and do something else. Yes, oh, you've got a new job for me the week after? Terrific, I'll do that. I can do some training, fine, we'll accept change. Then that's a culture which is probably going to change really rapidly, but there'll be a trade-off with that. Can anyone tell me what the trade-off would be? The culture is all about change and people are doing different things and getting training and changing their job and everything like that. What's the and so easily able to follow strategic changes required. What would be the trade-off? It's actually two trade-offs, a bit related. The first trade-off is that it's probably not very good at anything. If everyone's constantly retraining and changing what they do, they don't have the 2 or 3 years to really become very good at that thing. I was in design, but then I moved over to marketing. That was pretty good, but I didn't do that for very long because then I went out on the road for sales for a while. Now in distribution. Except we don't do distribution anymore, we outsource that, so I'm really just outsourcing. That person is not going to really be very capable in any area because they've just moved around, they've followed the flow, but they haven't had the years of consolidation of capability and how it exactly works in that organisation. So that's one drawback, that the organisation that changes a lot has lower overall levels of capability. There's a second drawback. Can anyone think of what that is? Yes, that would be less efficient, and that would be, probably I would put that with the capability one, because capability can be efficiency. Come back to this quotation that I had some time before. Culture is what people do when no one's watching. If you've got this organisation that's all about change, and everyone's just changing what they do, and the rules and the regulations and procedures and stories and values and everything are constantly changing or really not settled on anything, what's the consequence of that? They could be demotivated. Even more generally, they're going to be, they're going to be unpredictable. You don't know what they're going to do. If you just create a constant change, and then you've got, for example, the people who front the customers, you don't know what behaviour they're going to display. One person's, oh yes, I'll give you everything. Next person's, what? No, you can't have anything. And another person says, oh, I'm not really very interested. Another person says, let's talk about technology, because they've all just, there's no consistency. There's all of the features of consistent behaviour that culture provides through the values and the beliefs and the consequent behaviours. All of the structure around that is not there in an organisation that changes very rapidly and dramatically. So people are very unpredictable. So whilst an organisation with a very change-oriented culture might be able to move with the strategy quickly in terms of what they would accept, their overall capabilities, their efficiency, and their predictability in terms of what they actually do when there's not a clear-cut rule or regulation is sufficiently diminished. So we rely on culture, but we also are constrained by culture. Yes, so I think, what else? In terms of working out what strategies we can realistically adopt, therefore we need to do a cultural analysis to work out what the culture, to make sure we completely understand what the culture is capable of doing and not capable of doing. Not surprisingly, senior managers who have been with the organisation for a while have got a pretty good idea of what you can do and what you can't do. Our staff will accept this, but they won't accept that. We can move into this area, but we can't move into that area. They can be relied on to behave this way, they're not going to behave that way. But nevertheless, most individuals perception of this is very personalised, very subject to their own individual experiences and their own personal biases. So a more objective assessment is going to provide a better basis for working out what strategy will fit with and what it won't in terms of the culture. Later, when we look at developing new strategies, we'll consider how it affects the existing culture, and then we'll also consider the implementation in topic 10 as to how, what implementation approaches are acceptable and what are not. But the baseline from it is actually objectively understanding the culture you have, which is, if you go all the way back to the cultural audits I was talking about earlier, the reason the cultural audits are attractive is that an objective third party comes in and says, you might think your culture's like that and you might think the other, but when no one's watching, this is what the culture really is. This is what you've got to work with, either to change or to utilise, but that's your point of reference. We already did strategic drift. So I've already got the diagram there about strategic drift, the environment. So what tends to happen is, as I said, you can't keep up because of culture with the rate of change in most environments. You reach a critical point where the gap has got so big that the organisation's no longer competitive. And then there is a very dramatic event, which is predominantly focused, well, it's focused on what you would describe as a new strategy, but it's really a catch-up, and it will typically involve a very painful, difficult and expensive cultural change. So we talked about gradual changes already. The consequence of the culture driving you towards being consistent with everything you do, because then you do it well, and if you're getting away with doing it that way, it's all right. So if you look, for example, at airlines and you think about Qantas, Qantas went along for many years, quality, safety, reliability, and boring, and expensive. And then the market said, you know what, there's lots of cheap providers now. And Qantas said, well, we can't do that. But we can start up Qantas too, and we'll call that Jetstar. And that's all different. Different staff, everything is different in Jetstar. Different planes, different systems, different people, everything. They just stepped away from their existing system. So they got the two operating completely in parallel, hardly any sharing. There's a little bit of hardware that moves backwards and forwards, but even to this day, many, many years after they formed Jetstar, they still operate them independently. So Qantas is a classic example of, we follow the market, our fares have gone down and our service has gone down, and we've managed to keep the safety record, and we're just incrementing along, but we're becoming sort of more and more expensive. And then Jetstar's sort of going along with the other group, and it's probably keeping up better, but eventually it's going to find there's some strategic drift there as well. So steady as you go provides, no one minds a safe airline, no one minds a dependable airline, no one minds a familiar airline, you know what you're going to get. Those are all things that are still valuable, and therefore the organisation's getting away with increasing levels of gap between what the market wants and what they do, because they've still got some fundamentals which aren't too bad, and they're very good at it. Because safety is still valuable and they're very good at safety, they're able to say, well, look, our culture is all about safety. We're the safe airline. That's it. And you can't argue that. So that is very much in their favour, and the fact that they've been doing it since the 1920s is why they're able to do it so well. Jetstar actually manages to borrow a bit from that safety thing, but they don't have that history that enables them to make that claim, and they don't. They say, look, we're not really terribly reliable. Luckily, our planes don't fall out of the sky, so that's pretty good, but we're really cheap. And that's what they've got to offer, and so those are two entirely different things, but you can't create what Qantas still trades on without just keeping doing the same thing for year on year on year on year. So, yes, so there is an inherent value to maintaining what you do, even though you'll become increasingly irrelevant, and then you reach a point, and there will be a point without doubt for Qantas when their airfares is just simply twice what everyone else pays, even in their segment of the market, and they won't be able to compete anymore, and then they will just have to simply wind down what they currently do. I've actually been quite surprised that they've managed to keep the traditional Qantas model going as long as they actually have. I thought with Jetstar, after about 5 years, they'd wind down Qantas to some sort of mini premium service, and all of their activity is in Jetstar. But they have managed to really hang on to that. But it's an absolute vestige from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's a really old basis for competitive advantage. Okay, so by way of summary, the history and background conditions determine the culture, organisational culture that you have to work with, and that enormously influences what the organisation does well and doesn't do well, can do and can't do. In particular, the history and the path dependency resulting from the rituals and traditions and rules and regulations and expectations and values and everything will determine how things happen and what can happen and what can't happen. So these are things that we build into an organisation by virtue of building the organisation and its culture. And they will determine what you can and can't do, and if they support what you need to do, great, you'll be successful. And if they don't support what you need to do, then the organisation has huge problems. So the organisational culture is a two-edged sword. If it's a good thing like safety in air flight, it's going to support that and you're going to perform very well in that area. And if it's a bad thing like above market costs, it's going to push you to continue to have above market costs, and that's going to be a very bad thing. How do you unpack above market costs and safety? You can't. So that's a massive issue for the organisation to try and solve, and it's often unsolvable, or it takes 20 years. As a result of that, the organisation tends to change its culture. It tends to change more slowly than the external environment, and the gap between what it should be and what it is, even though it may do it very well, what it is very well, grows and grows until you reach a critical point where the gap is too great and the organisation is no longer competitive. Even though it does a whole lot of things really well, they're not enough anymore. They're not the right things to make it competitive. The culture has kept it away from keeping up with what it should be, and so then it has to go through some painful and dramatic transformation. And we talked about the alternative of an organisation that would just kept up with its strategy and just reinvented itself continuously, and the drawbacks associated with that, which were unpredictability of behaviour and limited actual capability, because it never spent enough time doing any one thing to enable it to be able to actually perform well in that area. Okay, that's it. Next week we're going to talk about business strategies, and that's chapter 7 of the textbook. After we have our break, we're going to deal with the case for this week, which is Barclays Bank. Oh, did everyone have a look at the timetable? You will have noticed that I put the cases in the timetable as was requested. I did put a note in the news as well to that effect. So we're going to, after the break, we're going to have a look at the cultural audit, a little cultural audit for Barclays Bank, and then in the time remaining, we'll just go back and have a quick look at the case from last week, which we didn't have a class for because that was Good Friday. So let's break until 10:30, and I'll see you all back here at 10:30. Commence because time is on the march. And we've got about an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes in which to do this. So before we get started in the cases, and whilst we're waiting for people to come back in, does anyone have any questions or comments or observations, either relating to what we just talked about or about the assignment? Yep. So I'll repeat the question for the recording. So you asked how can we know how long it will take to make the change? Clearly, it's going to be partly depend on the magnitude of the change. You can always slide a small change in. People can always do one more thing. So I remember many years ago, I was at a major steelworks in Korea called POSCO. And we were being had a bit of a tour and met people there, and the guide said, yes, we're very proud of our innovation. We've introduced an innovation focus recently. So obviously you can imagine steel works, making big plates of steel to go in ships and things like that. Probably innovation is not right at the top of their game. It's a very slow changing industry. He said, yeah. So I said, oh, so how does it work? Oh, we have a suggestion scheme. I said, oh, I see. So you make suggestions. Yes, we're all required to produce 100 suggestions per week. So they just stuck that over the top. And in that cultural context, you could do that much. Right now, I could not imagine, because they had like thousands of employees, what they were going to do with hundreds of thousands of suggestions. But anyway, that was their thing. So you could overlay that thing, and you could just say, this is it, this is the rule, you can do that. You can't do 10 of those things, because then everything will come unstuck. But you can give people one more job. So it's a question of the magnitude of change. As I said, you can always slide one thing in quite quickly by just saying, from next week onwards, everyone has to come up with 100 suggestions. You want to keep your job, come up with suggestions. It's not that big a deal, full stop. Some cultures, they would, like in Germany, they'd say, well, that's not constitutionally acceptable. You can't do that. That has to go to the union. This has to happen. You have to give a 6 months warning, so you can't do that. But in other countries, yeah, all right, we understand those are the conditions, will comply. So depending on your particular context, as I said, you can usually get away with a small change relatively quickly, but a large change will take much longer. So the other dimension of this is whether it's simple overlay, we want you to do something else, which is in many ways easier, and even if it's there's something that you don't require, you can continue with that characteristic which is redundant and just allow it to slowly fade while you've imposed the new characteristic. So if you want people now to come up with innovative ideas, and one of the other characteristics of the culture is that people are very time consistent. They're always exactly on time. Really, you don't care that much about super punctuality. Being roughly punctual is quite satisfactory in your new innovative environment. It's not. It used to be really important because of the way the regulations work, but now being to the minute punctual is not as important as it used to be. So you can stop rewarding that, and slowly that capability of being to the minute will drift away, and people will end up being punctual to 5 minutes, and so you can just allow that to fade. So again, that sort of relatively superficial change, given politics and some other things we'll talk about in the implementation of strategy, you can get those things in. But if it's a fundamental change where we need you to stop doing this and we need you to start doing something else, those are the ones that take a long time. And the more severe the change, the longer it's going to take, because you go back, I wish I had the slides up right now, but you go back from the behaviour to the beliefs, even to the values. And the bigger the change, the more you're going to have to wind all the way back. And if you've got to go all the way back to the values, we are a value for money, family-oriented company, and you want to stop that. We no longer make middle-class underwear that's good value and lasts a long time and all families want it. We now make fashion clothing, and we make it offshore, and it's all about being up to date, and it's low quality, but it's very up to date and it's cheap. That's a fundamental value change, and that is the thing that's going to take you 10 or 15 years. If it's really just about beliefs, you can say, look, same values, but we now believe that we can achieve this otherwise. Then it's still going to be hard to do, because really, same value, different beliefs, I sort of can see that. It will still take time, years, but not the decade sort of. And if it's really just about something superficial, it's just like, okay, well, same place, same beliefs, but I just have to do it a bit differently. I've got to use a computer to do that. I used to do it paper. It was really good when I did it on paper. It really worked really well for everyone. But we do it on computer now. It's okay. Then you can get people to do it quite quickly in a space of short order, and training and things like that will tend to drive that, where they'll see the value. Good. No, good question. Anything else? Okay, let's have a look at what happened with Barclays. So what's Barclays? The bank. You can read that. What else? What else can you say about Barclays? Everyone's read the case, you've memorised it all. It's actually easy to memorise these cases, they're very simple. One of the largest and oldest banks. So it's all about being new and creative and dynamic, right? No, it's all about tradition and being a fundamental pillar of the economic structure of the country and being focused on probably predominantly more on high income earners because historically those are the people who originally banked and lifetime employment, and no one wants to leave Barclays Bank because if you're in the banking industry, where are you going to go to? So it's all about steady as she goes. And how would you describe, from even this description, the culture? One good word, and it starts with the letter C. Consistent? Yeah, not bad, but it wasn't quite the one I had in mind. Another guess? They're corrupt. Oh, well, maybe, but probably they would like to think they're not corrupt. C-O, first two letters. Come, we'll play hangman again, see how many letters I can tell you before you get. C-O-N, C-O-N-S. Conservative. Very conservative. The most common, the most expected, the most standard, and the least questionable behaviour is the one that they will display. Can you give me a loan for this unusual thing? No. Can I invest my fortune with you at a low interest rate? Yes. Yes. So all about highly predictable, highly defendable, non-contentious behaviours with a massive connection with tradition and history. And is it a bank that's likely to be focused on technology, or is it a bank that's likely to be focused on stories and histories and so forth? Stories and histories, because they've got so much of it. You know, a couple of hundred years, you can't avoid the influence of that. Technology, it fades into insignificance compared to the immense weight of hundreds of thousands of employees setting the standard and creating the expectation. Nevertheless, in the case, what has happened to the organisation? Disruptive change, lots of change. Yep, very good, very good. How have they done that? How have they forced that into this conservative culture? The very CEOs, how did they do that? It wasn't so much about rewards. There was a dimension of that. Some of their staff were overpaid, as the case explained. The main mechanism they used for introducing new sets of behaviours to access different markets and have different behaviour was to simply introduce a new division and keep it quite separate. So it's really a conglomerate of a number of organisations. Some of the organisations are the traditional Barclay Bank with the history, and others sit alongside and service a different market and behave differently. And what can you say about the culture between the new divisions that they've introduced and the existing ones? What can you say about the cultures? Are they the same? In fact, the case points out that the cultures were very different, and there was internal conflict and suspicion and so forth between the cultures. So you see the same thing here at the national level. I'm a Melbourne-born person, so I have a natural distrust and suspicion about anyone who comes from Sydney. And I can say with complete confidence that anyone from Sydney is very derisive about someone who comes from Melbourne, because even though Australian culture, they are separate cities, they've got different histories. Melbourne was founded on planning and gold mining, and Sydney was a penal colony, which was developed in a fairly random manner, but with a high rule-based hierarchy. So there's a cultural overlay behind the two cities, which is quite different, and therefore they have different cultures. And therefore we have a natural suspicion about one another, and we believe that without any question in our heart of hearts that our city is infinitely better than the other city. So even though you've got these two divisions in the same, or many of these divisions in the same organisation, the fact that the investment division operated differently to the consumer banking division meant that the two divisions, there would be a cultural divide between the two, even if the gap was quite small. However, some of them were relatively extreme. One of the CEOs introduced, for example, I think that was Diamond Bob, introduced the tax evasion division. Now, they didn't call it that, did they? They had it was wealth maximisation or something, but it was basically to assist people to minimise their tax exposure. It's not illegal, but they went very, very close to and occasionally stepped over the line, probably pretty much by accident. So you could imagine that the tax evasion division would have people who are all about, here's an opportunity, how can we distort rules and regulations for our customers' benefit, compared to the people who are operating in the savings bank section, who are all about, well done, you've had your money in here for 50 years and it's got a 5% improvement year on year, minus inflation and bank costs and so forth. But it's great, you're a really long-term customer. Fundamentally different ways of looking at things, therefore their behaviours are different, therefore the beliefs are certainly different. What they were there for solidity and put your money with us for your whole life and we'll look after you, versus come, we'll deal with you right now, we'll get you this tax cycle will get you an extra £5,000 or £10,000 tax return, so that'll be really good for you. And even perhaps down to the fundamental values. What's important? Family and savings and solidity and long-term future is important for the savings people, and short-term return and benefit and financial advantage and having that second yacht and that sort of stuff are fundamental values for the people in the other section. So both entirely legitimate, but quite different. So therefore, big differences in the cultures. And how they've done that by just simply saying we're going to have a new division and that's going to be there and doesn't fit too well, doesn't matter as long as we make money, we'll try and get away with it. But did they get away with it? No, not so well. Why? Because they were still trying to use centralised resources, centralised decision making, probably centralised finance, centralised marketing and so forth to cover two different cultures, and that's very difficult. If you're, for example, all about marketing the dependable personal savings division, and it's all about our marketing, our approach to marketing is about security and, sorry, I've got to put the microphone on. Security and consistency and reliability, and we'll be here when your grandkids are wanting to bank, and you know your money is 100% safe with us. Those are messages that marketing would give out for that division. But marketing for the tax minimisation division, do you want a new yacht? Do you think the tax man gets too much of your money? How can you be more successful? Well, we're here to help you find ways of making sure the tax man doesn't get your hard-earned money. Completely different messages. And you can imagine that these are the problems that they face. Two different cultures, two different sets of values. How do that? It comes through in all the behaviours and the decisions that they make. Okay. So, I set this up to put some... actually, I have to escape out of this. some stuff in some of these boxes. So, historical influences, what did we have? What else? Traditions, good. Again? Legacy. How is tradition, how is... Okay. Historical? You mean original, yeah. Okay. Sorry? Innovation? What's the historical innovation? I missed a bit of that, sorry. There's a lot of noise from these machines. You need to speak up loud. I'm sorry, I still can't quite hear. You're suggesting technology? And technology is a historical influence? In the industry? Would you either use the microphone or come a little bit closer? Your voice is quite soft compared to the background noise. Okay, all right, that's fine. We'll continue on. So, any other historical dimensions? I guess the only other one is that they're a major financial institution. So the company, industry, government is reliant on them. They're not going to ignore it. When the banks here, for example, misbehave, you often get a government reaction because they're really critical. The big banks are really critical components of the way things are done. So there's probably also a long-term political influence. We don't want you going out of business. We don't want you taking risks. We'll underwrite you, but we have expectations as well, and they will come through. So there will probably be a strong reflection of British politics over the last couple of 100 years creeping through as well because of their unavoidable strong connections with government. So, oh goodness. All right. What about culture? What immediate cultural influences would we have? The conservative, okay. So that's probably that's a description. That's a summary description. So we sort of put that at the end. Okay, so conservative culture, but what leads to that? Well, first of all, the national culture. What else? Yep, okay. So, divisional cultures. Investment in the commercial and the private banking. We also, of course, have the overlay of banking practices, don't we? Bankers, as a profession, have their own culture as well. So, professional or industry or segment culture. That's probably enough. I think we've collected enough of those. Ooh, that wasn't supposed to happen. Now, where's the box for this one? Okay. Oh, I don't know why it keeps jumping. It's quite funny. All right. So, what can we say about rather than perhaps calling this the cultural web? I don't think I can. No, I can't edit that. We consider this to be the summary of the culture. We've already had it as conservative. What else? What's our sort of overriding conclusions about the culture then? Anything? Some of it's aggressive, but some of it would be passive too, wouldn't it?